Welcome to everyone who is watching, whether you're watching this recording in the digital community or you're watching this on YouTube, welcome. Today's topic is one of my favorites to do coaching on, subhanAllah. I think it is a topic that is very underkept. It's not something we discuss, but it has one of the most important implications on healing trauma. And we'll jump right into it, inshallah. I want to start off by just sharing a quote, one that I think is so powerful in describing the topic we're going to talk about today. So Dr. Gabor Mate, for those of you guys who are not familiar with him, is at this point kind of known as one of the world's leading specialists and educators on trauma, specifically complex trauma. And he says the greatest damage done by neglect, trauma, or emotional loss is the long-term distortions they induce in the way a developing child will continue to interpret the world. So if you still don't know what the topic is for today, we are going to be talking about childhood trauma. How do we heal childhood trauma? What is the reason that childhood trauma is so destructive, and how we can use that information to empower us rather than to allow us to kind of sit back and just allow things to happen. So before we can even talk about childhood trauma, I want to kind of use some data, right? And give you guys some insight into one of the most powerful research studies that the CDC has ever conducted. So if you don't know what the CDC is, it's a Center for Disease Control. It's one of the leading research institutions in the world, but it's located in the United States. So for those of us who are in the United States, the CDC sets up guidelines on several health-related issues. In the late 90s, they conducted a study called the ACE study. This was called, or stood for the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And what they wanted to do, along with a big hospital institution called Kaiser Permanente, they essentially wanted to see if they could enumerate the impact of childhood trauma on the development of children into adulthood. So this was a study that actually they researched like 17,000 people. That's a huge number when you think about it in the grand scheme of research. So it really is like it's a very good research study. And they essentially, what they did with this study is they had these 17,000 people fill out a form where they would be able to count or give a number to, be able to give an objective number to the types of traumas that these individuals endured. So for example, they were, told to share, do you experience trauma that involved physical abuse, hunger or poverty? Did someone in your family have severe mental health issues? Did you watch someone in your family get abused? Did you have a family member who went to jail? So these were different adverse childhood experiences, and they wanted to, the word for some reason is escaping me, quantify, that's a word. They want to quantify that and see, for people who had a higher ACE score, meaning they had more adverse childhood experiences, i.e. more childhood trauma, did that actually affect how they grew up, their, determined success in life? And I say success in quotes because obviously success can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but they were kind of looking at it in terms of financial success, physical health, mental health, relational success, things like that. What did they find through this study? In this study, like most people don't know about it, which is shocking. I've come across even medical providers that don't know about this, despite this being actually one of the biggest influences in how we practice medicine for children. But the conclusions of the study truly were like mind-blowing. So first and foremost, it helped us realize that childhood trauma is not as uncommon as we once thought. About 64% of the participants had at least one adverse childhood experience. Now, more extreme childhood trauma or more intense, where it's a multitude of different traumas affecting the development of the child, was a lot more uncommon. So 12% reported 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, and that's 12% there. That's just about 1 out of every 10 person. The other thing that was just change the way we see childhood trauma is they found what they call a dose dependent effect on human beings when it comes to childhood trauma. What does this mean? The more childhood trauma someone experiences, the more adverse effects they experience later in life. the more their health was affected, the more their financial success was affected. So the correlation was direct, and as one went up, so did the other. And next is a really, really powerful one. And I always forget the actual number, if it was 20 times more likely, or I think it's something around that. But they found that ACEs are linked to several health conditions and that they significantly increase the risk for those health conditions. We're talking cancer, we're talking diabetes, we're talking about autoimmune conditions. Autoimmunity is very significantly linked to trauma. That doesn't mean because you have an autoimmune disorder, it's because you were traumatized or you have trauma, but it's to say that it's a huge contributing factor for a lot of people. And many people don't even realize that. This one is a little easier to understand, but childhood trauma significantly increases the risk for mental health issues, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, bipolar disorder, issues in relationships. Next is that people who have childhood trauma are more likely to engage in risky behaviors, smoking, drug use, alcohol use, other addictions, right? Very, very, very commonly associated with childhood trauma. Why? I mean, one, oftentimes this is used as a coping mechanism and a way to numb the pain and suffering that comes with childhood trauma, whether they are, doing this as teenagers or even well into adulthood. And because of the effect on mental health, we know that individuals who have higher, mental health disorders are also more likely to engage in such behaviors. Then the final two is more individuals like this are more likely to experience issues like relationship difficulties and job instability, which ultimately will affect your, overall happiness in life, and then your financial success, right? Your financial stability is so, so important. Lastly, it can affect parenting behaviors, which leads to a cycle of trauma and adversity in subsequent generations. We all know this because we talk about generational trauma, right? If someone grew up with childhood trauma, not realizing that affects the way they see the world, they might be using those same exact traumatizing methods with their children, not even realizing the effect that it's going to have on them. And to explain is not to justify. It's wrong because it's wrong, but we can also understand how generational trauma actually continues, right? So now that we understand all of these different effects that childhood trauma can have, the question that comes up is why? Why is childhood trauma so damaging? And how, if someone has trauma, childhood trauma, should they be hopeless? Does that mean that actually there's nothing they can do and khalas, they're damned to, a life of mental illness and unhappiness and financial instability and horrible relationships? No. The answer is no, and we'll talk more about that. The reason childhood trauma is so damaging is a few. I'll name just a few, inshallah. Number one, childhood trauma is very different than adult-based trauma, right? A traumatizing situation you experience in adulthood is happening at a time where your brain is fully developed. And so I say this in the sense of a single trauma, clients that I've worked with who only had like a single traumatic experience that happened in their adulthood, it's a lot easier to get them out of that because their preceding state was one where they were generally mentally healthy, and so their brain is wired to that. So basically we're trying to get them back to where they once were by integrating that trauma. Childhood trauma is occurring at a time where the child is developmentally vulnerable, right? This is where your brain is quite literally building itself. It is growing, it is rewiring. And so trauma comes in and affects that development. It can have implications on the way the amygdala forms, which is the part of our brain that essentially allows us to have fear reactions and emotional reactions. It can affect the hippocampus, which is the part that stores memory. It can affect our ability to pay attention. It can affect parts of our personality development, and your personality development is part of your brain development. So it's coming at a time where that development is happening, and the architecture of your brain is being affected because of that. And now where someone is starting off is very different than if they were adult who was generally healthy, didn't have childhood, didn't have trauma in their past, where they would start off. That's number one. Number two is many of our foundational beliefs about the world, about ourselves, about, how things should operate are actually developed in childhood trauma. I would go as to say majority of them are. Whether we come to terms with that or not is, what ends up what makes the difference between people who succeed in their healing and don't. in my opinion. But if that's where your foundation and foundational understanding of how the world works is coming from, well, then how are you going to operate in the world? If you believe that people can't be trusted, if you believe that people are out to hurt you, if you believe that you're unlovable because that was the messaging you were receiving, what's going to end up happening? You are going to grow up as an adult who believes that people can't be trusted. So you are going to probably be a loner, not be willing to connect with people, have a very difficult time building a relationship. Healthy relationship in your life is one of the key research-based like, how do I want to explain this? There's a huge Harvard research study on happiness, like what actually led to the greatest amount of happiness. And they found relationships, healthy relationships, were the determining factor. It wasn't how much money you had. It wasn't how, how healthy you were. It wasn't even your poverty status. It was the relationships you had around you. So that affects your ability to connect. If you are suffering internally, you're going to end up with very, heavy mental health issues that end up affecting the way you operate at work, the way you operate around friends, what you're willing to do for your physical health. And then, of course, the stress on your body from all of that leads to a deterioration of your health, which is why there's so much there's so much research, even after the ACE study, on how childhood trauma affects different health conditions or the likelihood of different health conditions. So that is a few important points about why childhood trauma is so damaging. Now, how do we actually begin healing it? Right? That's a big question. And we have to start off, if you remember, the first ever coaching call that we did in the group was all around kind of building a mindset of hope and healing. And what does that practically look like? And like, how do we create an ironclad mindset so that as you're doing this work to heal trauma, whatever kind of trauma it is, childhood trauma or otherwise, you are willing to go through the discomfort of it because there's something other on the other side. And of course, this is a foundational belief of our deen, right? As Muslims, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, Inna ma'al usri yusra, indeed with hardship comes ease. And that's in two ways. That's indeed with hardship comes ease, meaning as you're going through the difficulty, there are pockets of ease that are accompanying it, but also at the end of the hardship, when it is resolved, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala resolved it for us and we're doing the work to, aid in that resolution, there's ease that follows. So we have to be hopeful, because one of the additional studies on ACEs, on the adverse childhood experiences, found that people were actually able to mitigate or reverse these risks. And how? By doing the work, by doing the healing work, right? If you're someone who is willing to, get the support you need for your mental well-being, you're willing to build those healthy relationships, even when your core beliefs are telling you it's not good for you or it's not safe for you, you are starting to stack the healthy behaviors in your favor, which then mitigate those risks, right? So I want to introduce a concept which many of you guys might already be quite familiar with, and that is reparenting. But before we do that, this is something I've used with some of my one-on-one clients to help them, begin their childhood trauma healing journey. So if you can understand that as a child, you did not get what you needed, that right there is fundamentally trauma is in overlooking or a breakdown of a core need of an individual that ends up disrupting the nervous system so significantly that it has lasting impacts. That is what it is. A need was taken away. We have to be able to understand and come to terms with what those needs are. This is not just for the fact that we have to grieve those needs that weren't met, right? But also because if we don't know what needs weren't met, then we don't know how to meet them as adults, and we then can't reverse the risks that we were talking about earlier on. So this is just a fun way that I like to use to help people kind of get a sense of, okay, how do I actually figure out what it is that I needed, what my actual trauma is, and then we'll go from there. So this is a prompt that I like to start with. And anyone who's watching this, wherever you're watching this, I would actually recommend you get out a piece of paper, like an actual notebook, and do this with us, essentially. Well, we're going to do it live here, but do it with us so you can actually have something to look back to. Okay. So the prompt here Because oftentimes when I say, okay, what did you not, what was your childhood trauma? There's some people who don't even realize they have childhood trauma. I literally have people who have all the signs of complex PTSD, and then they'll be like, but, I don't know if I had childhood trauma. Did I have childhood trauma? And then as I'm hearing them talk about their childhood, like, yeah, that you had childhood trauma. So what did you need in your childhood that you didn't get? What did you need? Need is very different than want. I wanted, this, dirt bike or this doll, and I didn't get it. It's not childhood trauma. That's just it's just okay, you can get it. It's just something that you couldn't get at that time, but it's not traumatic. I needed food, and our fridge was empty most of the time. That's childhood trauma. So I'll let you guys kind of reflect on this a bit. And I will invite you, inshallah, to in the chat box, just share like a few things. I needed XYZ during my childhood and I didn't get it. For those whose childhood trauma is secondary to abuse from parents, you can change this prompt to I needed XYZ from my mom and dad, or my mom or dad, depending on who it was. And I didn't get it. Or if you had another caregiver, a grandparent, an uncle, an aunt, I needed XYZ from my caregiver and didn't get it. So I'll wait for some recommendations to come in the chat, and we'll start to type it in, inshallah. Okay. So someone said I needed a hug, physical safety from my parents and didn't get it. So we'll put I'm going to put physical safety as one, and then I'm going to put affection as another. Because I think physical safety can also be like if you were physically abused by your parents, if they hit you. I think many of us grew up in cultures where it was very normalized to hit your children, and to go as far as to beat your children. And it took a long time for me to like undo the wiring around that, to realize actually that's not normal. That is not normal. That is abuse. Okay, someone wrote love and care. Let's get more specific on that one. What does love and care actually look like? Because someone could say, well, affection is love and care, right? So what does that actually look like? What would love look like to you, receiving love? So I like this one. I needed my parents to tell me I'm safe, and even though they shouted, that it didn't mean that they hated me. The emotional neglect began then. So to not be emotionally neglected. To not be emotionally neglected. Funny enough, and I was having a discussion with another like trauma practitioner on this, and emotional neglect is a type of adverse childhood experience that is harder to process than physical like neglect. Like there's so much objectivity when it comes to physical neglect. I didn't have the food, I didn't have a warm, whatever, I didn't have clothes. We can but emotional neglect is often so distorted, and it affects a child's self-image so intensely that it's hard to rip it away, like from who they are. You are not your physical neglect, right? If you needed clothes, if once you got clothes, you got clothes, but you become your emotional neglect. All right, somebody said unconditional love from my caretaker. I felt abandoned most of the time, as if I wasn't a good kid. Unconditional love. Yeah, someone mentioned I fell into people pleasing to feel accepted, and that's so true. 100%. You emotionally neglect. These needs are going to get met one way or another, right? Okay. Anything else? I remember someone once said something that was so interesting to me as Muslims, as a Muslim child, they didn't receive guidance from their parents. Their parents weren't particularly religious or there was religious abuse. So they don't feel like, and that is a need. That is a need of a child. It is a right of a child to be taught their deen. It is a right of a child to learn how loving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. It's a right of a child to learn fiqh, right? It's one of the first requirements of a parent to give their child. Validation, to not be told constantly that you can't do anything and nothing we do is worth appreciation. That's so powerful. It's so interesting that of all of these, majority of them are related to emotional development, while only one of them was related to physical development. It just once again goes to show which wounds are the ones that actually stay with us, right? Which ones are the ones that actually shape who we are and how we see ourselves and how we show up in the world, right? And for any parents who are watching this, if you're watching this on YouTube or the community, this right here is going to, oftentimes I'll come across parents who are like, who themselves have trauma and then they don't realize they're traumatizing their children, but they're like, well, I do this for my child. I feed them, I clothe them, I take them to school. It's like, cool, you're meeting their physical needs, but at what expense? And as a parent, you have way more to do. This is an amana from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Your child would actually appreciate more and benefit more, body, mind, and soul, if their emotional needs were met at the highest, even if their physical needs weren't always met to the highest, right? If there was financial difficulty and you couldn't always get them the nicest clothes, or sometimes you had to be mindful or thrifty around the food that you ate. They will appreciate that they were loved, they were seen, they were heard, they were validated, they were protected emotionally. They weren't, told that they were bad children. They weren't made to feel like they were a burden. That is going to be what is going to allow them to be a thriving adult. How to regulate my emotions. That is so interesting. I needed to learn how to regulate my emotions. Oftentimes, this one is interesting, right? Because the emotional dysregulation of parents um, affects children so much, because who are the first people we learn how to communicate and how to regulate from? It's your caregivers. Those are the first people. And oftentimes the lack of emotional regulation comes from mental health issues. So oftentimes a lot of these right here that we see here correlate to the parents also having mental health issues, whether it's major depressive. I can't tell you how many people I've come across where it's like, yeah, my mom was chronically depressed, or my dad was like, very, very depressed, but he showed it in his rage and anger, right? Which then there's a huge correlation and risk associated with having a depressed mom or specifically a depressed mother, and the child being depressed. I forgot what the risk, the number is, if it's 2 times or whatever it was, but it's incredibly significant, and that's because the environmental effects are so profound when you're growing up. Okay, so we got quite a few good ones, right? Now, all of this here is not to make us, brokenhearted over what was not received. Yes, there is a grieving process, because at the end of the day, childhood is childhood, meaning you can't go back there and you can't go back in time and change it. But that doesn't mean that because you experience these or that you didn't get these, that you can't meet those needs or those needs can't be met. And this is where we introduce the concept of reparenting. So reparenting is a really, really cool idea. I like to call it getting a second chance at childhood. What does reparenting look like? Now, yes, you experience these things during childhood. Yes, it affects the way you see yourself and you see the world. But you're also, whether you realize it or not, exposed to other ways of thinking and seeing the world as well. You are going to inevitably come across people who have a healthier mindset around things, who didn't experience childhood trauma, and you're going to take note of what that looks like. That is information. And as we read, you can watch videos. You guys are part of this community. Those who are watching my YouTube channel, you're gaining this information. You get to use that to mitigate the risks associated with childhood trauma and actually start to heal it. Reparenting looks like, if I didn't get XYZ from my parents or my caregivers, or sometimes your trauma is actually not related to the home. It might be related to things like displacement or abuse in school, right? If I didn't get those needs met, how do I now, as an adult, meet those needs for myself? Because it's almost like there's a little kid inside of us that is still waiting for those needs to be met. And once we realize that actually we can do this for ourselves, it's like getting to be, I think I just said this, but it's like getting to go through childhood one more time, but as an adult. So I think someone sent a message. Let me just see what that was. Oh, someone said, I feel like my dad has ADHD symptoms, but that wasn't diagnosed. It seems like it is by his behavior. There's so many cases of undiagnosed mental health disorders. It's the only way for it to be diagnosed is for you to go to a clinician who actually will look at you and be able to say, okay, this is what's going on. But how many people are willing to actually do that, admit that they need help? Very few. Yeah, very, very few. So reparenting, let's do some exercises. For each of these needs, what we do when we're reparenting is we need to think of a way to meet that need. Now, this might be something really like big that you decide to do for yourself, or it might be the subtleties in how you speak to yourself. It doesn't have to be this magnificent change. What is this doing for those, you're wondering, okay, Hannah, cool. Like, what is this actually going to do? This is going to start to give your brain the opportunity to rewire that old wiring, right? Because although you'd been neglected for, X many years, the way our brain rewires is by introducing new experiences and new memories. And the old memories start to weaken. Neurons, when they connect, by the way, the wiring of our brain, it doesn't break. It actually just gets stronger or weaker. So what we want is the old patterns to weaken, and we want to create new ones that end up getting stronger. So that's what this part of reparenting looks like. So let's start thinking of some ways that we can do this. I'll keep this up here and I'll just write it down. What would it look like to meet the needs of physical safety for yourself? How about allow yourself to live in a safe place, a safe neighborhood if you can afford it, right? An apartment or a home that doesn't have mold or mice, right? Um, if that was part of your childhood trauma. Um, it might look like going to the doctors when you need to. I know that seems weird, but for some people, their childhood trauma, there was neglect there. So they weren't able to go see the doctor when they were sick. They were essentially told to basically suffer as long, if you don't need to go to a hospital, we're not going because it's an inconvenience. If you were hit or beaten defending yourself as an adult, very often people stop getting hit when they're adults because guess what? They're big enough now to do something about it. Not doing it to your child. These are more general examples of unmet needs. So you can also take the general unmet need and specify it to what it was for you. Okay. How do we meet the need of emotional regulation? Anyone have any ideas? Get creative. How about we learn how to emotionally regulate? How about we don't shut down our emotions? This is a very common survival technique, right? We shut down the emotions. We allow ourselves to just be frozen. Your heart becomes hard as a rock. You can't think, people can't make you cry. They can't make you angry. You're just shut off. You go into freeze. I love that. Someone said having self-soothing, journaling, coaching, counseling, having a safe space to talk about emotions without, yeah. So seek therapy, seek coaching, journal, self-soothe. All right. Affection. How do we give ourselves affection? And I'll put affection, love, and care all in one here. And you know what? Affection, unconditional love, and I'm going to put here learn Dean. I think that's one of the most affectionate, self-loving things you can do. Share your thoughts as well. I love that community like this. Sorry if I'm seeing things come up a little later. I love that my phone Siri just came up. Communities. Communities where you feel seen, where you feel connected, where you feel cared for, where you have experiences, sharing experiences with other people. What else? Anything else come to mind for you guys? I think self-validation is really important. Many of us have a very intense inner critic that comes as a result of childhood trauma. And being able to self-validate, like, hey, it's okay. You're angry. You're not a bad person for being angry. You're allowed to be angry. There's certain things you can't do because you're angry because it's haram. But anger in and of itself as an emotion is not a sinful emotion, right? You mess something up, it's okay. Guess what? Mistakes happen. You are allowed to make a mistake. You're allowed to correct it. You're allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to do all of these things, regardless of if your caregivers made you think you can't or cannot. You are a human being. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you with free will. You have the parameters of deen. So long as you're within those parameters, it is fine. You dropped something and spilled something, you're not an idiot for that. That's okay, right? This self-talk, point can be really, really powerful. So I would, okay, funny enough, validation is going to be one of the next ones, and we can self-validate. We can stop seeking validation outside of us. So, okay. So those are all different points of reparenting, right? You can make this as specific as you want. You can use a tracker, something like a journal or a way to track your progress. You can work with a coach who can help you do this. There are lots of different ways to do reparenting. Now, reparenting is just one part of the kind of greater plan of what needs to be done to heal from childhood trauma. But it is something, if done effectively, if done with intentionality, if done frequently, you can make huge strides, and you'll find yourself in a place where you're so much more content with who you are. You're less grief stricken and angry at the past. You're able to be more present, and you're able to you get to build a new version of yourself. So with all of that being said, someone said, let me see, self-compassion, identifying limiting beliefs, and reframing. I love that. And then doing little things you thought at childhood you wish to do. Self-appreciate yourself with all the things you do, without guilt, and where you go to feel better. This reminds me of a funny story that I'll share, which is this wasn't related to childhood trauma. It came up when I was younger. I really wanted to rollerblade, but my mom refused to let me get rollerblades. I had a bike, but I wasn't allowed to get rollerblades. She said it would break the cement. Which I'm pretty sure rollerblades are not as heavy as an actual bike, but whatever. As soon as I was old enough to start working, had my own money, I went to the thrift store and I got myself a pair of rollerblades. Then I was like, I'm going to teach myself to rollerblade, and it was just the most inner child work I'd ever seen. Then I ended up slipping, falling, hit my tailbone so hard that for literally 3 months after, I could not sit down without pain. And maybe I learned that day why my mom said no. And then, subhanAllah, those same rollerblades I gave to someone to borrow, and then they left it in a basement that ended up getting flooded, and they had to throw it out. So that was my reparenting experience. I'll conclude this here. For all of those who are watching on YouTube, if you enjoyed this video, then go ahead and like and subscribe, inshallah, and leave a comment with any questions that you have. And thank you so much for watching. For the rest of you, stay on so we can do some coaching and questions.